Hello, this is the HPRA presentation on temperature mapping. As we're aware, most medicinal products have specified storage conditions with respect to temperature. Temperature mapping is important for verifying the efficacy of the storage areas, systems and equipments within to maintain the required conditions as to ensure the safety, efficacy and quality of the medicinal product. It's also a requirement outlined in Chapter 3 of the EU GDP guidelines. To frame this with respect to deficiencies, Chapter 3 saw the second highest number of major deficiencies cited in our Deficiencies Trending presentation, which was also presented in the May 2022 HPRA Information Day. This is owing to the high-risk nature of temperature maintenance and the effect an excursion may have on the quality of the product. So in relation to the major deficiencies cited, we saw that 87% of the major deficiencies cited was in relation to the management of the temperature at the site being deficient. 79% were resulting from mapping studies either not being performed at all or not being performed correctly. 47% of the major deficiencies cited were in relation to either change controls, kappas and deviations that were either not raised at all, not raised correctly or not fit for purpose. 23% of the major deficiencies cited were in relation to storage of medicinal products at the site. And lastly, 20% of the major deficiencies cited were in relation to validation studies and the management of transport with respect to temperature. To give an overview of this presentation, we'll be looking at temperature mapping throughout the distribution process. We will be looking at the following three areas. The first is a systematic approach to conducting temperature mapping, which can be applied to both ambient and cold chain medicinal products. We will then look at specific guidance for cold chain medicinal products. And lastly, and briefly touch upon considerations for the transportation of medicinal products with respect to temperature. From the outset, I'd like to say, while some of what is mentioned in this presentation may seem quite basic, it bears mentioning as it's often the fundamental aspects that get overlooked or not documented in the processes and result in deficiencies. The first step in the process is to identify the requirement for a mapping study. In my experience, a mapping study is required in the majority of cases. However, for significantly small spaces used for the storage of low-risk medicinal products, it may be appropriate to solely conduct a risk assessment. In this instance, it's important the company document its evaluation of the proposed storage area and identify any risks within its assessment. At a minimum, we expect the use of a max-min thermometer to be employed for means of continuous temperature monitoring within the storage area. Moving on to the majority of cases in which a temperature mapping study is required, the following steps can be adhered to. 1. Outline the protocol and how to approach the study. 2. Perform a risk assessment to identify the placement for the temperature monitoring probes. 3. Conduct the study. 4. Interrogate the findings. And 5. Document the results and conclusion. The first step is to create the protocol to outline how the company intend to approach the study. So you expect an initial mapping to be conducted, which involves the installation qualification and operational qualification. So this should show that the storage area and equipment within is capable of maintaining the required conditions. It should also document the acceptance criteria, the proposed alarm limits and a set points. We then look to map under representative conditions. So in this instance, we expect the warehouse to be occupied with either empty boxes, non-medicinal products or dummy products at an occupancy that is reflective of the envisaged activities. So the same goes for the door opening. So consideration should be given to both the frequency and duration of door opening based on the envisaged activities. So for example, how many consignments is expected to be received in a given week, month, etc. And the same goes for goods out. So how many consignments will be sent in a week, month, etc. It's important to justify the frequency of the door opening within the study or the protocol. Lastly, it's important to conduct a power outage study to understand how long the company have to react in the event of a power outage. If there's any backup equipment, to understand how long it'll take to kick into effect, and if there's any impact on the temperature maintenance resulting from this changeover. After this, the company should look at the risk assessment to identify the probe placement for the duration of the study. So it's expected that they identify areas of risk. So, for example, the proximity of a storage area to things like a window, internal, external doors, or equipment such as aircon, chillers, etc., which may contribute to temperature fluctuation. Lastly, just before conducting the study, consideration should be given to the probes. So as you may be aware, temperature recording probes should have an accuracy of at least plus or minus 5 degrees Celsius. The temperature monitoring devices should be calibrated on an annual basis to a certified traceable reference standard. Calibration should be performed for at least 3 points across the range of temperatures for which the probe will be used. So for example, 0, 15 and 30 degrees Celsius for ambient warehouse probes, and minus 10, 0 and 10 for refrigerator probes. It goes without saying that auxiliary probes should be used during the calibration process. After all the above is in place, the next step is to perform your study. At this point, I think it would be useful to check in with the deficiencies previously referenced. So we saw the management of temperature at the site was deficient in 87% of the major deficiencies cited with respect to Chapter 3. Examples of that could include a failure to conduct an installation qualification or to document it, failure to conduct the study, the protocol under normal operating conditions. We could see that there was no door opening study performed or no justification for the frequency of the door opening, that there was no power outage study performed, that it was not clear if equipment was in use during the mapping study, or that the risk assessment was inaccurate in that it failed to consider the risk of, for example, the proximity of the storage area to a window, a door, etc. For mapping studies that were not performed correctly or at all. So not at all is self-explanatory, but examples of mapping studies not performed correctly, we've seen acceptance criteria not documented, studies not being conducted in line with the protocol, so a huge amount of effort is put into the protocol and then the actual study is not conducted in line with said protocol. The alarm limits or the set point of the room was not documented, or things like the environmental temperature on the day was not documented. So the company failed to create that snapshot in time to show what the conditions were at the time of the study. So after you've conducted your study and you have your data, it's important you interrogate the data and document the results. So we know at a minimum the company should identify the areas with the most extreme temperature fluctuations. So for example, the highest and lowest temperatures recorded, and to place permanent temperature monitoring probes in these areas. But depending on space, it may also be appropriate to examine additional areas of flux and place probes in those locations. So this is an area that's often overlooked. Companies go straight from the study to the conclusion without outlining any rationale or reference to the data to outline their justification. So justify the number of probes and placement of the permanent temperature monitoring probes with reference to the data. It's also important to document how the door opening and power outages will be managed, again with reference to the findings. After this, we look at documenting the results. So it's important that the conclusions of the study is documented, of course, in the mapping study, which is signed off by the ORP, but also within the company's QMS. So things like the location of the permanent temperature monitoring probe, so the permanent probe placement map, the set point of alarms or the set point of any equipment used, or if equipment is used seasonally, it's important to outline at what point it would be used and when. Consideration should then be given to the repetition of mapping studies. So we know that mapping studies should be conducted in both winter and summer, but consideration should be given to the timing of when these studies are carried out. So it should really stress test the impact of the more extreme weather conditions on the company and warehouse's ability to maintain the required conditions. We'd also expect remapping to be performed in the event of structural changes at a set periodic frequency, or action to be taken in the event of a temperature excursion. Revisiting common deficiencies. We've saw examples in where the management of temperature at the site was deficient, could include that seasonal mappings were not performed, or that the company failed to document things like the set point, the alarm limits, the use of equipment, or the location of the permanent temperature monitoring probe and the map within the company's QMS. We have seen that mapping studies were not conducted correctly in that the company failed to document justification for the number of permanent temperature monitoring probes or the placement. It failed to outline justification for the management of door openings, or that there was no evidence of RP oversight. We also see in relation to change controls, kappas and deviations. We've seen deficiencies in that change controls were not raised for the introduction of new equipment or structural changes in the warehouse, and that subsequently did not lead to a trigger to remap the warehouse, again leading to deficiencies, or else deviations from set procedures within the company's QMS with respect to temperature management were not followed. So moving on to specific guidance and consideration for cold chain. So while all of the above can be applied to mapping studies for both ambient and cold chain medicinal products, there is a recognition that cold chain medicinal products have a higher chance of temperature fluctuation and therefore a high degree of risk associated with it. So the following factors should be considered, particularly with respect to the mapping of cold chain medicinal products. So the first is spacing and occupancy of the medicinal products within the fridge or freezer. So a full fridge or freezer will struggle to maintain those lower temperatures. So it's important we see within the study and again in normal operating conditions that the company have given thought to the occupancy and the spacing of the products within the fridge or freezer. We also need consideration in relation to the storage of medicinal products in its proximity to chillers or airflow units. So naturally, if there's a chiller above the storage area, this area will be colder than the rest of the storage unit. Therefore, it's expected during the mapping study that there is definitively temperature monitoring probes to show that the required storage conditions are maintained. And it may be that it is not appropriate to store products in these areas, in which case we'd expect to see signage put up and it documented it within the QMS. We know that the frequency and duration in which the storage area is exposed to ambient temperatures by way of door opening will also impact the ability to maintain those lower temperatures. And then finally, think of the operation of equipment. So for example, is there a dual system, so system A and a system B that rotates while one is in defrost? Has this been captured and planned for in the protocol and subsequently in the report? How will it work? For example, is it a manual changeover or is it automatic? When will it happen? And is that changeover impacting on the temperature at all? So it's important that's evaluated within the actual study. And lastly, as discussed, we're going to briefly look at considerations for the transportation of medicinal products. As we're aware, there's two main types of transportation for medicinal products. So we've got active transport, in which there's temperature controls in the vehicle. In this, we expect a similar approach to mapping as we have discussed for storage areas. So we have our IQ, OQ, and PQ, as well as a degree of continuous temperature monitoring. And then we also have passive transport, in which the chiller and freezer bags are packed into cool boxes in order to maintain the required temperature. So I want to look at the management of passive transport with respect to temperature mapping and monitoring. So the first elements I'm going to discuss are in relation to the actual cool and freezer packs that are used in passive transport. So it's important to remember before we go into that, IQ, OQ, and PQ is expected for the fridge and freezer used for the packs. This is often overlooked, but it is expected. So in relation to the packs themselves, it's important the company identify the manufacturing specifications. So for example, for a chiller pack, we could have stored 5 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. We then need to think of the effect of the following. So one is the loading of the product. So as we know, loading a high number of ambient bags into a fridge or freezer will of course cause a temperature spike. The same goes for exposing the storage area to ambient temperatures by means of door openings. So by doing this either in one large go, all products go in, or by adding smaller portions of ambient bags with multiple shorter door openings, all of the above will have an impact on the core temperature of the fridge or freezer. So consideration should be given to this when conditioning the packs during the validation study and of course during normal operating conditions. So remember, if the specification of the manufacturing specification says store at 5 degrees Celsius for 24 hours, time must be allowed to facilitate the temperature spike which has been caused by the aforementioned factors to settle and for the unit to reach the required temperature. Only then should the conditioning timer, or that's the timing of which the conditioning starts, so the 24 hours, start. To reiterate, it's important the company understand the impact of product loading and door opening to ensure they can meet the manufacturing specifications and the correct conditioning times. Lastly, as a standalone, I'd like to bring attention to the packing of passive boxes during transportation. So as discussed, we know seasonal weather will impact on the ability to maintain the required temperatures. So it's important company carry out temperature validation, which may include variance of the number of chiller and freezer packs used in the box to ensure that required temperatures can be maintained and to ensure the safety, quality and efficacy of the products. So this brings us to the end of our discussion on temperature mapping. To summarize some take-home points, it's important the company consider the environment and the impact it may have in parallel with the proposed activities. So examine the warehouse that the company have to identify risks such as windows, doors, within the study and to examine that, and also to consider it in parallel with the proposed activities, the envisaged occupancy, and the frequency of door openings. Then to document the environmental settings at the time of the study. So it's important to show the settings and what was in place during the study is reflective of normal operating conditions. So things like the set point of any equipment used, the alarm limits, or the external temperature on the day should be documented. Justify, justify, and justify. I can't emphasize how many deficiencies start with there was no justification for. So it's important, as we said, not just to go straight from the study to the conclusion that permanent temperature monitoring probe placement map, but to actually outline the justification with reference to the data. So it's important that you've shown interrogation of the data and that you have justification for example, the placement of the temperature monitoring probes, or the frequency of door opening, or the management of equipment at the site. After this, we look at documenting our findings, so again outlining it in the results and conclusion of the study, which is subsequently signed off by the ORP, as well as translating that into the company's QMS. So it's important to ensure that all the hard work that's gone into the study is appropriately captured in the QMS so the operators may continue that in day-to-day operations. And lastly, consider changes which may trigger the requirement to perform a remapping exercise. I've outlined here further resources the company can refer to if they would like to do further reading on this topic. Thank you for listening.